Well, we're getting to the exciting part of the book of Revelation. You've been waiting for this. We're into chapter 6. But I have to ask you a couple of questions as we look at this message on the opening of the seals of God's judgment. Now, when we think about God's judgment, we think about that for the evil and the wicked and all the people who do wrong. But part of the question might be, as we look at Revelation chapter 6, there's a certain justice and fairness that we might not want, because if God judges and we're not perfect, we might be part of that judgment process. Now, if your faith is in the Lord Jesus Christ, you are safe, you are sound, everything is good. We're going to look at that. But there are sometimes, have you ever gotten to the point where you're just fed up with the unfairness and the injustice of life? Most of us probably are at that point right now, whether you're talking about politics, whether you're talking about people cutting you off in line, people taking your parking places and stuff like that. I have a bugaboo, and I have to tell you about it. Whenever I'm waiting, my sense of fairness and justice, whenever I'm waiting in line to purchase something, and there's one cashier that's open, and the line is like 6 people deep, and another cashier opens up and says, instead of saying, "May I take the next customer in line?" they just say, "I'm open on aisle 2. And people rush to there. And I have been known to be indignant and simply say, "Excuse me, this lady was in line before you, or I was in line before." It violates my sense of justice. It just drives me, why people are not considerate that way, it just drives me up the wall when that happens. And so if you and I have that sense of fairness and right and justice, why do we get upset when God decides what's fair and what's right and what's just? And we don't want Him to necessarily do that. At least if it doesn't affect us, it's okay. But as long as He's affecting, quote, those wicked people out there, we're not part of that, because we don't fail, we don't sin, we don't ever make mistakes, right? You know what we want? We don't want God's justice. We don't even want God's fairness. We want God's mercy. And that's what we get in Jesus Christ, and that's what we need. But if you have a sense of fairness that makes you want to fix things in your daily life when they're wrong, here's the question. If we have such a strong sense of this justice and fairness, is God unfair to judge us or to judge our world? Now, all the events that start happening in Revelation chapter 6 are God finally settling the score. Do you know what the seals really are? They're a will. They're God saying, this is the promise of the will. What do you do in a will? You see what your inheritance is, right? You find out, what did Grandpa leave me? What did Grandma leave me? What did my mom and dad leave? That's what a will does. Well, that's what God is doing in these 6 seals. It's a will that basically says, this is what you are inheriting as a part of the kingdom. But in order to get to that, there are judgments and things that God has to do to make the world right, to fix the problems and deal with evil and wickedness, so that we can enter into a kingdom that's a kingdom of righteousness. Now let's review for just a moment. Chapter 1 in Revelation is the vision of the glorified Christ. Chapter 2 and 3, we looked at the 7 churches of the book of Revelation and the address. Now, all of this is stuff that has either happened in the past or in the present up until those 7 churches when they were existing in that first century. When we get to chapter 4, we see a scene in heaven. It's the throne room of God. And remember, the key verse in the book of Revelation is Revelation 1:19, where where God says to John, write the things that are, that is the glorified Christ, write the things that are going to be in the future, and he divides it down into these areas. Write the things that are going to be in the future, and that's the prophecy from chapter 4 up to the end of the book, 22. So chapter 4 is the throne room of God. Chapter 5 tells us that the only one worthy to open the seals is Jesus Christ. Remember, John wept and wept bitterly because he said there's no one to open the seals except Jesus Christ. And then the Lamb of God was discovered there in the midst of this great assembly to open the seals. Chapter 6, the opening of the seals of God's judgment. And we're going to look at those today. We want to look at the first seal, which is a white horse. Now, I did some research on this, and there are people, there are even good theologians, who think this white horse is Jesus. But it's not. Because he doesn't show up until later in the book of Revelation when he returns in his second advent. What's the first advent that we celebrate? Come on. Christmas, the birth of Jesus Christ. Second advent is his return in victory. And it's interesting, I was doing some research, and if you're a Jehovah's Witness, they've got it all wrong. I'm sorry. I went back and looked at some of the writings, and basically they're saying this first white horse is Christ, and he became, now I don't know where they get this number from, but he became king of heaven in 1914. It parallels with World War I. Now and the only reason I can think is Charles Russell, who was the founder of Jehovah's Witness, must have been around that time that he kind of pulled, he was actually in the 1800s, but their theologians kind of pulled this out because it was the greatest war that we ever had, and then we went on and had World War II. And so they say that he became king of heaven at that time. Now there's no biblical basis for it, but that's what they say. And they say this horse with the white rider, the white horse with the rider, they say is Christ. It is not Jesus, because Jesus doesn't show up later. It's a world leader, however. Revelation chapter 6 and verse 1. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. This is what John is writing. And then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." Now he's not talking to John, he's talking to the rider on the white horse. And in each of these cases with the different colored horses, there are 4 horses. We call them the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. He says, "Come." And I looked, and there before me was a white horse. And everybody, because white is, for victory and everything else, everybody jumps to the conclusion that it's Christ. But Christ isn't even on the scene yet in this story. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown. That crown is the Stephanos crown, which another reason, it's not a strong reason, but another reason is when they talk about Christ. Remember I said a couple weeks ago, God the Father, when they talk about his crown, it's a diadem crown. It's a royal crown. Stephanos crown was the Greek word for the Olympic crowns that were given out. A lot of times they were wreaths or some other kind of vine that was horned. So this was a different type of crown that this white horse rider has. Jesus, when you get to later chapters of Revelation, he also is referred to as having the diadem crown, equivalent with God the Father. And he says his rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. Now keep that in mind. Here's an artist's rendering of the white horse, the fiery red horse, the black horse, and then this looks like an off-white horse. This is actually a pale horse. The Greek word is vegetable green, but it's not dark vegetable green, it's a light vegetable green. It's kind of like the figures you see at Halloween, where they're sort of a greenish, pale, ghostly type thing. That's the color that's described in the Greek for the pale horse, and you'll see why when we get to it. The Bible Knowledge Commentary on this white horse and horseman says a better interpretation, rather than it being Christ, is that the conqueror mentioned here is the future world leader, sometimes referred to as Antichrist, though the book of Revelation does not use the term Antichrist. It'll use other terms. He is probably the same person as the ruler of the people mentioned in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26. We're going to go back there in a moment. This ruler has a bow without an arrow. Now this is what John Walvoord says, and he's a really good commentator. He has to be because he's from Dallas Seminary and was one of the presidents there. But he says the ruler has a bow without an arrow. All it says is he's a conqueror and he has a bow. Well, John might have said he has a bow and an arrow, or he might have just said he has a bow to include an arrow, because why would you go out without a bow without arrows? I don't know. So I wouldn't put a lot of weight on that, but there is some validity to it, because what he's saying is he has this bow without an arrow, indicating that the world government that he establishes is accomplished without warfare. We know that the Antichrist, somehow, it's not through warfare, it's a peace treaty with Israel that starts the first 3.5 years of the tribulation period. So some of this might be right, but I wouldn't press it really hard on the idea that he doesn't have an arrow. He continues, the future world government begins with a time of peace, but it is soon followed by destruction. And 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 3 tells us that. In general, the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, the next three sets of judgments of divine wrath, signal the terrible judgments of God on the world at the end of the age, climaxing in the second coming of Christ. Now that's another reason that Christ is not the one on the white horse, because he's coming back later, not at this point. This is just introducing that first set of plagues. Now I want to look at Daniel's prophecy, because it parallels this part of the book of Revelation and other parts of the book of Revelation. Here's Daniel's prayer, and this is a great lesson about prayer, just as an aside. Daniel chapter 9, verse 20. Daniel speaking, he says, while I was speaking and praying, and what was Daniel doing? Confessing his personal sins first and the sins of my people Israel, and making my request to the Lord my God for his holy hill. So he was praying for Jerusalem. All right? While I was still in prayer, Gabriel, one of the angels, actually the messenger angel, the man I had seen earlier in the earlier vision, came to me in swift flight about the time of the evening sacrifice. He instructed me and said to me, Daniel, I have now come to give you insight and understanding. He's going to answer some of his prayer and his question about Jerusalem. As soon as you began to pray, a word went out. I love that expression. The minute you begin to pray, God is on it. I want you to know that. A word went out, which I have come to tell you. For you are highly esteemed. Therefore consider the word and understand the vision. And here's Daniel's vision, his prophecy. Daniel chapter 9, verse 24. Now this gets a little complicated. We're going to be coming back to this often, because it hinges and fits the book of Revelation. 77s, all right? What's 77s? 490, right? Are declared for your people and your holy city, Jerusalem, to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place, talking about Jerusalem. He continues, know and understand this, from the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, who's the anointed one? That's Christ. The ruler comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens, right? So if you take 7 sevens and 62 sevens, how many sevens do you have? Do the math. 69, right? 62 plus 7 is 69, but he's talking about 70 weeks. So you're going to see what happens here. This is how precise prophecy is, and this is hundreds of years before Christ, hundreds of years before our time, like now, thousands of years. And it says, it will be rebuilt with streets and a trench. That's talking about Jerusalem, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death. That's a prophecy of Jesus' triumphal entry and then being crucified, and will have nothing. So he doesn't become king at that point. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end, and desolations have been decreed. Not a pretty picture. He will confirm a covenant. Who is that? It's the Antichrist. With many for 1 7. All right, so there's a 7-year covenant that's going to come. But in the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. So 3.5 years in, first he's going to make this treaty with Israel. This has not happened yet, to our knowledge. And probably when it happens, it'll be right around the time the rapture will be right in that mix, if not before it. He will confirm a covenant with many for 7 years. In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifices and offerings. So he's a peaceful world leader, has a peace treaty with Israel. People have tried over and over to figure out when this is, and they put it in different places in history. It has not happened yet. And he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. Jesus talked about this in Matthew. He says, be warned when the one who comes and sets up the abomination that causes desolation, in other words, the Antichrist, that the end is near. Right? Until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Now, the Bible Knowledge Commentary and J. Dwight Pentecost, one of the professors who wrote part of this book, gives this insight. The fourth decree was also by Artaxerxes. There's a series of decrees back there in Nehemiah's time. We've got to jump ahead. And it was issued on March 5th, 444 BC, 400 years before Christ. On that occasion, Artaxerxes, who was the king, granted the Jews permission to rebuild Jerusalem's city walls. This decree is the one that Daniel referred to in chapter 9, verse 25. This prophecy of the 77s then ends not with the first advent of Christ, as some have suggested, but rather with the second advent and the establishing of the millennial kingdom. So it's future. That last week, it goes from 69, then there's a space of 2,000 years plus, which is the church age, and then we're going to enter into the 70th week. You will not be here for the 70th week. You'll be with Christ in heaven if you know Christ as your Savior. Pentecost continues. According to Daniel 9:26, the Anointed One was not cut off in the 70th 7. He was cut off after the 7 and 62 sevens. Now, I know it gets complicated math, but after 69, incidentally, 69 weeks equal years. That's why it's 490 years, 7 times 7. And they had run their course. This means that there's an interval between the 69th and the 70th. What I just said, the 69th is completed when Messiah was cut off, and now we're in between in the church age. God's going to redevelop his program with Israel and pick it up for that 70th week, those 7 years that we call the tribulation. Christ's crucifixion then was in that interval right after his triumphal entry, which concluded the 69th 7. The interval was anticipated by Christ when he prophesied the establishing of the church in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 18. This necessitated the setting aside of the nation Israel for a season in order that his new program for the church might be instituted. Christ predicted the setting aside of the nation in Matthew chapter 21 verses 42 and 43. The present church age is the interval between the 69th and the 77th. That's all you need to know. We're in a parentheses for 2,000 plus years. Now, I know that seems strange, but that's what they were prophesying. That's what Daniel was talking about. So let's look at the second seal then. The red horse. Chapter 6 of Revelation, verse 3. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. The rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. So this was probably at the 3.5 period when things started to break down, and that's what's taking place. So the first one goes out, he's peaceful, somewhat has this contract, and he's a conqueror, but he does it subtly. The second one, the red one, comes out, and war starts. Now remember, this is all in a 7-year period. The third seal, the black horse. Chapter 6, verse 5. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine. What does that mean? 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages. What's a day's wages in the Roman world? It was a denarii. That was a day's wages. Worth anywhere from 15 to 20 cents. How'd you like to live on 15 to 20 cents? Now, given inflation and everything else, if you look at what you would get for a day's wages, what they're saying is that for your whole day's wages, you couldn't pay your mortgage, you couldn't pay anything else, you couldn't put gas in your car. It would take all of your wages for 2 pounds of wheat and 6 pounds of barley. And 6 pounds of barley would probably do you in meals for about 3 days. So it's going to take, in that economy, it's a problem. And it says, and do not damage the oil and the wine. Now what's probably happening here is the crops have been destroyed, and so it costs so much more for wheat and for barley, but it's a short-term famine that's taking place. And how do we probably know that? It's because he says, do not damage the oil. That would be olive oil. That would be the hardier olive oil trees, and the wine, the grapes. So in other words, those field crops like barley and wheat would be destroyed largely, and it'd be hard to find it, and it'd be very expensive. But it's not going to last long enough, this famine, to affect the olive oil and the wine, which in Israel's mentality, there are olive trees all over in Israel, and it's a big, big thing for them. The fourth seal, the pale horse, it gets worse. Now this is the one that looks like the ghoulish light green from Halloween. Verse 7 of chapter 6. When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, come. I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death. This is the first time they give the rider a name. And Hades, or the grave, was following close behind him. So guess what's happening here? There's a famine, there's a problem, and it's causing, if there's warfare, and then it goes to famine and food shortage, people starve to death, and so the pale horse is the result of all of this chaos that is happening in the tribulation period. Now thank God you won't be in that if you know Jesus Christ as your Savior. But think about people, if it happened today, think about people you know who would not go to heaven. Now many, we're going to see that in chapter 7, many become followers of Christ out of the tribulation period, but you don't want them to go through that if they don't have to. Its rider's name was Death, and Hades was following close behind, and they were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague. If you think COVID has done a number on us, as sad as that is, as troubling as that is, you ain't seen nothing yet. By famine, by the sword, by plague, and by the wild beasts of the field, by the wild beasts of the earth. Because guess what? If there's a food shortage, if there's famine, guess what they're going to do? They're going to start to attack. They're going to attack each other. They're going to attack human beings. Now I want to suggest something. Does anybody know, don't look at that yet, what the world population is? I blew it. I said to my wife this morning, I said, you want to look really, really smart? When I asked the question about the world population, and I put it up too soon, you know, I said, if you say 7.8 billion, you're going to look brilliant in the congregation. But I blew it, yeah. So, yeah, I had a shill in the audience. So, but the world population is 7.8 billion right now. 1/4 of that would be 1.9, almost 2 billion people would die. Just take the United States. Anybody know the population? I know she doesn't know this one. Population of the United States. You're really good. 331 million. But it keeps growing. 1/4 of that would be 82.75 million. 82. Almost 83 million people in the United States, if it even exists. at that point. This is quite a famine, quite a plague. Now, in the book of Revelation, sets of 7, like the 7 plagues, the 7 trumpets, the 7 bowls, often run in a series of 4 and then 3 to make a total of 7. So we've actually looked at 4 different ones that were in a set, the 4 horses, the 4 horsemen. Now we're going to look at the next 3, but we're only going to look at 2 of them today because the 7th one rolls into the trumpet judgment. But the first 4 seals are focused on earth, while seal number 5 is set in heaven. So we have to change the scene and look at what's going on in heaven. The 5th seal, the souls of those who have been slain. This is those who have been slain in the tribulation period, those who have died in this 7-year period. And we're believers. Okay? If you're a believer before the tribulation starts, this is my view, you get raptured, you're out of here. But what about all the people who are left behind? Well, many of them will hear your testimony, remember what's going on, will somehow come to know the Lord. But some of them, because they won't take the mark of the beast, they will be martyred. They will be put to death. And these are the ones that he's talking about here. The 5th seal is the soul of those who had been slain. When he opened the 5th seal, verse 9, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony that they had maintained. They didn't take the mark of the beast. They called out in a loud voice, How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood? Okay? Things are still a mess on the earth. Then each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer, have patience, until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters, who were killed just as they had been. In other words, there were others who were going to be killed in the tribulation period. It's going to be an awful time. And you can't just wring your hands and say, wow, I'm glad I'm a Christian because I'm not going to be there. But there are real people who are going to suffer through this. And we'll look at that as the chapters go on. And I want you to see some observations about people who have gone on to heaven before. It doesn't matter whether they're the slain martyrs or whether they're relatives that have gone on before. Those in heaven, those believers in heaven, are aware of their surroundings. They don't have their resurrected bodies, but they have some form of a body, and they're very, very much alive and very much aware of their surroundings. They're worshiping. But not only that, and this is a question I get asked often, those in heaven are aware of at least some events on earth. Because apparently here in the tribulation period, they know what's happening enough on earth to know that people are being martyred. And I don't know how this happens. I don't know whether the angels talk to them, because the angels are all around us. I don't know whether when someone passes away who's a Christian and they go to heaven, they bring in lots of information. You know, I thought about people that I've done funerals for, and I realized that, you know, my dad's there in heaven because he was a believer. And then I think about, other people, and I think, wow, I wonder if they've met my dad. I wonder if my dad has met them. You know, all that. And when that happens, because they're real intelligent beings, they're able to talk about stuff, from their experience. And you say, well, if you learned about the earth, wouldn't you be awfully sad in heaven? Well, the difference is that you're learning about the earth, and no matter how sad the news is, like these slain believers, knowing others are being martyred, no matter how sad the news is, you're viewing it through the grid of God's ultimate victory. That God gives you perspective that says, you know what, this is a temporary thing, and this will be over, and you'll be ruling and reigning with me in the kingdom, and you can't have a bad attitude in heaven, because it wouldn't be heaven if you had a bad attitude in heaven. And those in heaven are anxious for God's justice, like the Lord's Prayer. When's the last time you prayed the Lord's Prayer the way it's supposed to be prayed? Your will be done on earth as in heaven. That's a prayer for God's kingdom to start today. Your kingdom come. That's the kind of life Jesus wants us to live, so that, we're not just praying for Aunt Sally's medical procedure or whatever is going on, that we are saying, God, look at our world. Look at the political situation. Look at our lives. And we want your will to be done like it's done perfectly in heaven. We want that on earth. And the only way that'll happen is if your kingdom comes to earth, if you wrap up your program. So there's nothing wrong with praying for that, and that's what they were praying. And God said to them, just wait a little bit longer, and it'll happen. It'll be fulfilled. The sixth seal. There are 6 parts to the sixth seal. A great earthquake. The sun turned black. All these cosmic events are taking place, and terrestrial events are taking place. The moon turned blood red. It doesn't say the moon turned to blood. It says, and you've seen, have you ever gone out? My wife drags me out to see planets and moons and stuff all the time. And I've seen it 100 times. She's like, look at that moon! Look at that moon! It's, yeah, I'm doing something else. I want to look at the moon. But she's just, fascinated. The other week there was some planet out there, and that's never been there in the sky before. I said, it's a planet. I know it's a planet.
Not what I said.
What? Well, whatever you said, you were amazed at it. So anyway, we've seen things like eclipses and other things, and we've seen, where the moon just glows reddish orange. The stars fell from the sky. There's going to be, just all kinds of astronomical events going on. And the heavens receded. I don't know exactly what that means, whether the clouds move back or what happens, but something happens in the heavens. And not only that, every mountain and island is removed from its place. There is, if you go out to the Midwest, where there's lots of hot springs underneath, and there's the tectonic plates and all the other stuff. We know, in fact, I tease with my friend from Boise, Idaho all the time, because they are sitting on a whole bunch of volcanic plates and everything else. And I said, one of these days, before the Lord comes back, your whole place is going to blow up, and you're not gonna be. So, because he's always bugging me, why don't you come out here and live? I don't want to live out there. I don't blow up, Not that that's going to happen. But what happens is there's something going on the surface of the earth that is going to affect mountains. It's going to affect islands. It's just, whether it's the flooding, whatever's going on, it is going to be an amazing, amazing mess. Here's that review in verse 12. I watched as he opened the sixth seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. You ever seen a black goat with goat hair? That's black. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. That's the sixth seal. And the wicked begin to hide from the wrath of God during this tribulation period. Verse 15 of Revelation 6. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, didn't matter whether you were poor or rich, all the wicked hid in caves among the rocks of the mountains. And they called to the mountains and to the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. So God the Father and the wrath of Jesus Christ is just coming in all of these seals. Why? Because it's to ultimately root out wickedness and produce justice on the earth. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it? And so they hid. They said, we would rather hide out and just die. The seventh seal. We're going to close with this. The seventh, seal 7 opens the trumpet judgments in chapter 8. Now, you say, well, what happened? We were in chapter 6. How do we get to chapter 8? Well, chapter 7 is an interlude of the 144,000 Jews. Incidentally, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, you think that that's who that only the Jehovah's Witnesses are the 144,000. Has nothing to do with that. These are 144,000 Jews who are witnesses on the earth because they find their Messiah, and the martyrs in heaven from the tribulation period. So he outlines that in chapter 7 before he gets to seal 7 in chapter 8. Scary days? No. God doesn't want you to be afraid. God doesn't want you to miss one moment of your life living, representing Christ. But it does make a difference, because this is true. It's going to happen. This isn't science fiction. This is something that God says, I am going to do this. And if you're upset that God's going to do this, then go back and check your sense of justice. You know, when I get incensed that someone takes my parking place or someone butts in line in front of me, I know it's ridiculous. But God's not ridiculous. He has waited to judge the earth. He has given us opportunity after opportunity for thousands of years on this planet. And we have shaken our fists in God's face as a people for the most part. And a few, you, have trusted the Lord Jesus Christ and walk with him. And that's all he wants. He wants to redeem this broken and fallen world. And he will do that with his kingdom, but he's got to shake out all the garbage, all the wickedness, all the craziness. That's a sense of fairness.